The first gunshot cracked through Harwich General Hospital at 9:14 on a Tuesday morning, and for exactly 3 seconds, nobody moved. The sound bounced off the polished floors and the fluorescent-lit ceilings and the rows of plastic waiting room chairs, and every single person in that lobby made the same mistake. They told themselves it was something else. A dropped tray. A door slamming. Anything but what it was. Then the second shot came, and the screaming started, and a man in a gray jacket with a rifle leveled at the reception desk shouted something nobody could fully hear over the noise. And in the middle of all of it, a woman in faded blue scrubs stood up from behind an overturned chair, faced the barrel directly, and said, in a voice that didn't shake even slightly, "What's your name?" 7 seconds later, the gunman was on the floor. If you're watching this story for the first time, welcome. Subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's get into it. Nora Callahan had been a trauma nurse at Harwich General for 6 years, and in that time she had learned to disappear. Not literally, not in any dramatic sense. She simply had the kind of presence that registered as background. A competent, quiet woman in her mid-30s who showed up early, stayed late, kept her brown hair pulled back in a practical knot, and never once raised her voice at a physician even when they deserved it. She was 34 years old and wore no jewelry except a small scar along her left jawline that she'd had since before anyone at the hospital knew her. She made excellent coffee. She remembered patient names. She charted faster than anyone on the floor and never once complained about her charting, which made her either a saint or deeply strange depending on who you asked. Dr. Raymond Thacker, the chief of surgery at Harwich General, had a word for nurses like Nora. Reliable. He didn't mean it as a compliment exactly. He meant it the way you'd describe a good pair of institutional scissors. Functional, replaceable, never particularly interesting. When he referred to Nora in departmental meetings, which was rare, he called her the Hayes nurse because he consistently failed to retain her actual last name, and nobody corrected him, and Nora herself never brought it up. She simply absorbed it, the way she absorbed most things, with a flat, steady stillness that made people assume she either didn't notice or didn't care. She noticed everything. The Tuesday morning that the man with the rifle walked into Harwich General started the same way most Tuesday mornings started in Harwich, Virginia. The city sat in the low-lying part of the Shenandoah Valley where the highway curved and the mountains dropped back from the horizon. A mid-sized city with a mid-sized hospital and the kind of steady, manageable chaos that trauma departments ran on. Nora had been in since 6:30. She'd triaged 2 motor vehicle accidents, helped a second-year resident drain a hematoma he was too nervous to start on his own, and spent 45 minutes in room 7 trying to help an elderly man named Virgil understand that the hospital didn't have the authority to revoke his neighbor's parking permit, which was not a medical issue, but which Virgil felt very strongly about. At 8:50, a 4-man team of Navy operators arrived with one of their own on a gurney. The injured man's name was Petty Officer First Class Derek Wills, and he was in bad shape, a through-and-through gunshot wound to the right thigh that had torn through the femoral artery in a way that the field medic had managed, barely, with a tourniquet and a prayer. He was conscious, gray-faced, and extremely unhappy about the fuss being made over him. The 4 men accompanying him were all large, all controlled, all carrying themselves with the kind of compressed physical authority that filled a room without trying to. They wore civilian clothes but stood like military, and they had the look of people who had assessed every exit in the building within 30 seconds of entering it. Nora was the first nurse to reach them. "How long on the tourniquet?" she asked, already pulling on gloves, already reaching for Wills's wrist to check his pulse. The tallest of the 4 men, broad-shouldered with a jaw like a concrete step, looked at her the way people tended to look at nurses when they first arrived on scene, with the vague, slightly impatient expression of someone waiting for the real doctor. 43 minutes, he said. "He needs a surgeon." "He needs me first," Nora said, and unwrapped the tourniquet dressing with practiced hands, and the man with the jaw watched her do it, with a flicker of surprise he didn't quite manage to conceal. "What's his blood type?" "O positive." "Good. Did the round exit clean or did it fragment?" A pause. "Clean exit." Medic confirmed. "Okay. What's his pain tolerance been like? Any sign of shock onset before the tourniquet went on?" The operator looked at her more carefully this time. "He was talking the whole time, kept asking about the rest of the team." "That's actually useful." Nora straightened. You did good work keeping him stable. The surgical team is going to take him from here. Your names? The man with the jaw said, Chief Petty Officer Callum Rask. He didn't offer the others, and Nora didn't push. She nodded once and turned back to Derek Wills, who was watching her from the gurney with the slightly glazed, trying hard to hold on look of someone who had been running on adrenaline for the better part of an hour and was starting to feel the bill come due. Hey, she said, leaning slightly so he could see her face without turning his head. We've got you. You understand? You're at Harwick General, and we've got you. Wills managed a half smile. Is the food any good? Terrible, Nora said, but the company's decent. She stepped back to let the surgical team move him, and she stripped her gloves, and she went back to work. Behind her, she didn't hear Callum Rask tell the man next to him something quiet. She didn't hear the response either, but if she had, she would have heard Rask say, She's efficient. And the other man would have said, She's just a floor nurse, Cal. Let it go. And Rask would have said nothing else, but he would have kept watching the doorway long after she disappeared through it. The morning ground on. 2 more patients came through, a construction worker with a nail through his palm who was bizarrely cheerful about it, a college student with what she was convinced was appendicitis and what was, after evaluation, a pulled muscle from a Pilates class. Nora treated them both and charted them both and handed off to the next shift nurse on one and went to check on Will's surgical status on the other, because she had that kind of memory, the kind that didn't let cases go until they resolved. She was in the corridor outside the surgical suite at 9:14 when the first shot fired. The sound came from the lobby, 3 floors down and across the building, muffled by distance and walls but unmistakable. Nora stopped walking. She turned toward the sound before the echo had finished, and something shifted in her face. Not panic, not fear, but something more like a recalibration, a quiet, immediate internal adjustment, the way a compass needle swings when you bring it close to a magnet. She moved toward the stairwell. Not running, moving with purpose. The second shot came before she reached the door. By the time she hit the lobby level, she could hear the screaming and the crying and the shouted commands, and she could smell the discharge in the air, and she pushed through the stairwell door into a scene that had already broken past the point of ordinary panic. The lobby of Harwick General at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning held approximately 60 people, patients waiting for outpatient services, family members of admitted patients, a few administrative staff, a security guard near the main entrance who was, Nora saw immediately, already down, sitting against the wall with his hand pressed to his shoulder, conscious but immobilized. The man with the rifle stood near the center of the lobby, facing the reception desk. He was in his late 30s, medium build, gray jacket, dark hair cut short. He had the rifle leveled at a 45-degree angle, not aimed at anyone specific in that moment, held as a threat rather than an active shot, which told Nora he was not yet fully committed to shooting people at random. He was agitated. He was sweating. He was scanning the room with eyes that moved too fast, catching on faces and then sliding off them, and his breathing was audible from 20 feet. He was afraid. She registered all of this in the 3 seconds it took her to push through the stairwell door and assess the room. She also registered the following. 12 people were on the floor behind overturned furniture. Another 15 were pressed against the far wall, visible. 3 had already gotten out through the side emergency exit, which was still swinging slowly shut. Callum Rask and 2 of the other operators were near the gift shop entrance to her left, low behind a concrete pillar, and she could see immediately from their positioning that they had lines of approach mapped and were waiting for the angle. The problem was the angle. The lobby layout put 32 civilians between the operators and the shooter's 6 o'clock, and any move toward him from their position risked the rifle swinging and firing on a crowd. Nora set down her badge lanyard. She straightened her scrubs. She walked forward. She heard Rask's sharp inhale from her left. She heard someone near the wall whisper, "Oh God, no," in a tone of absolute horror. She heard the shooter's breathing change when he saw her moving, heard it sharpen with suspicion and adrenaline. And she walked toward him the same way she'd walked toward Virgil that morning when he'd been ranting about parking permits, calmly, directly, without a single ounce of performance. "What's your name?" she asked. The rifle came up. The barrel pointed directly at her face. She was 12 feet away. "Don't," the man said. His voice cracked on the word. "Don't come any closer. Don't." My name is Nora, she said, still walking, now 10 feet. I'm a nurse. Whatever is happening, I want to understand it. I'm not going to rush you. I just want to know your name. Stop. 8 feet. I said stop. I heard you, she said. 7 feet. I'm going to stop right here. She did. What's your name? His hands were shaking. Not badly, but enough. His eyes were moving between her face and the room around her, and she could see him trying to track too many things at once. The potential threats, the exits, the crowd, and now her, standing close enough that the rifle barrel was 3 feet from her sternum. Marcus, he said finally. The word came out like he'd been holding it underwater. Marcus? She kept her voice level, warm, conversational. Okay, you came here today for a reason. Whatever that reason is, I'm listening. A pause. But I need to tell you something first. The safety is off on that rifle, and you've got it pointed at my chest, and I'd really appreciate it if you could point it at the floor. Not because I'm asking you to surrender, just because I'd like us to have this conversation without either of us dying in the next 30 seconds. Marcus stared at her. The lobby was completely silent. Why aren't you scared? He said. It came out almost like an accusation. I am, she said. I'm just not as scared as you are right now. The barrel dipped. Not much, 6 inches maybe. But it dipped. Nora moved. What happened next was very fast, and most of the people in the lobby would spend the next several days arguing about the details, because nobody could quite agree on the sequence. What the security footage later confirmed was this. Nora Callahan stepped inside the rifle's arc in a motion that was neither large nor dramatic. A simple, precise pivot that took her out of the barrel's line while one hand came up and redirected the weapon down and away, and the other caught Marcus at the elbow, and something in the next 2 seconds involved a joint lock and a controlled throw that put him on the floor with his face against the tile and the rifle sliding away across the linoleum and Nora's knee on his upper back keeping him there. And all of this happened in the time it might have taken someone to blink twice. 7 seconds. From her first step inside his arc to the moment Marcus stopped moving. Maybe 6. The lobby erupted. Screaming, giving way to a different kind of screaming. The chaotic, overwhelmed release of 60 people whose terror had just detonated into shock. Callum Rask and his team were moving before Marcus hit the floor, crossing the lobby in long, fast strides with their hands out to move civilians and secure the weapon. And the other operators were shouting clear entry zones and calling in the situation, and someone somewhere was on the phone with police. And in the middle of all of it, Nora Callahan stayed where she was, keeping Marcus pinned with measured pressure, not punishing, not angry, just effective. Rask crouched next to her. He picked up the rifle and handed it to one of his men without looking at it. His eyes were on Nora. You need to let us take him, he said. I know, she said. Be careful with his shoulder. The left one. He took some kind of impact before he came in. See the way he's holding it? I think he might have a subluxation. Rask stared at her for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, Are you a nurse? Nora stood up. She straightened her scrubs again. She looked at him with the same flat, steady expression she'd worn the entire morning. Yes, she said. She went to check on the security guard. The next hour at Harwick General was controlled chaos at its finest. Harwick PD arrived in force within 4 minutes, 5 cruisers, and then a SWAT unit that showed up to find the situation already resolved and had to redirect their energy into crowd management and scene documentation. A detective named Garrett Sims took over witness coordination. An ambulance team treated the security guard, whose shoulder wound turned out to be a graze, serious but not life-threatening. Marcus was restrained, evaluated, and transported, and he didn't resist any of it, which the responding officers found almost as strange as everything else about the situation. Nora gave her statement to Detective Sims in a corridor near the nurses' station. She spoke clearly, chronologically, without embellishment. Sims took notes and asked the same question twice in different ways. Can you walk me through the actual disarm? The part where you took the weapon? And Nora gave him the same answer both times, which was that she'd been trained in patient de-escalation and had responded to the immediate threat, and Sims kept writing things down with the expression of a man who suspected he was missing something but couldn't identify what. You said de-escalation, Sims said. Yes. That wasn't de-escalation. The first part was. Sims looked at his notes. The last part looked more like... He paused. I don't actually know what that looked like. He's okay, Nora said. That's what matters. She went back to work. Callum Rask found her in the supply room 30 minutes later. She was restocking trauma kits with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been doing exactly this for years, counting packages and checking expiration dates without looking up when the door opened. That wasn't nursing training, Rask said. It wasn't a question. She'd known this conversation was coming the way you know a weather front is coming. You feel the pressure change before you can name what it is. She kept counting gauze packs. Close the door, please. He did. He stood just inside it, arms at his sides, watching her. Up close, she could see that he was being very deliberate about his posture. Not aggressive, not intimidating, just present in a way that communicated he was not leaving until this conversation happened. You assessed the room in about 4 seconds, he said. You identified that I had 3 approach angles to the shooter, but a civilian interference problem on all of them. You walked a line that kept his attention on you and kept his arc away from the crowd concentration. And then you performed a disarm and takedown that, he stopped, started again. Where'd you serve? Nora set down the gauze. She turned and looked at him. He was big, Rask. Not just tall, but built with the density of someone who had been in physical training for 20 consecutive years. And he had the specific kind of stillness that came from actual danger work, rather than gym work. His eyes were gray, and they were watching her the way she tended to watch patients, with a focus that was gathering information even when the face above it was neutral. I didn't say I served, she said. You didn't have to. A pause. You should check on your man, she said. Derek Wills, he's out of surgery, room 412. He lost a lot of blood and he's going to be tired and unhappy for a few days, but the surgeon got ahead of the arterial damage. He's going to be fine. Rask didn't move. I checked on him 20 minutes ago. Then you should let me finish restocking. Nora, he said. She looked at him again. Something about the way he said her name, not casual, not familiar, just direct, made her stay still for a moment. You're not in trouble, he said, quieter. I'm not asking officially. I'm asking because what you did in that lobby took a specific kind of training and a specific kind of nerve. And whoever you are not who you look like in those scrubs. He paused. That's not an insult. I know, she said. It's an observation, and it's not wrong. Another pause, longer this time. But I'm a nurse, Chief Rask. That's not a cover story. That's just true. He held her gaze, then he nodded, once, and opened the supply room door. How'd you know my rank? He asked from the doorway. You stand like a chief, she said, and you debrief your team with your back to the wall and one eye on the room. Second nature. You've been doing it a long time. Rask looked at her for another beat. How long have you been here, at this hospital? 6 years. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. 6 years, he repeated, like the number itself surprised him. And he left. The security footage review began at 2 in the afternoon. Detective Sims was running it with 2 of his team in the hospital's administrative security office, going through the lobby cameras, frame by frame, and they called Nora in to verify the sequence of events at 4 o'clock. She sat in the corner chair and watched herself walk across the lobby on the monitor and felt the strange, slightly dissociative experience of watching something she'd been inside from the outside. The whole thing looked different from the security camera angle. Smaller, somehow, but also more precise, more deliberate. Sims was watching her watch it. You know what my lieutenant said when I showed him this footage? I can guess, Nora said. He said it looked like a training exercise. Sims clicked off the monitor. I told him that was exactly what I thought. People do surprising things in emergencies, Nora said. Yeah, they do. He clicked the monitor back on, then off again. We pulled the shooter's car from the lot, 2018 Buick, registered to a Marcus Delvane, Harwick resident, prior mental health history but no criminal record. We did a sweep of the vehicle. He paused. There were photographs in the glove compartment, Ms. Callahan. She kept her expression neutral. Photographs of what? Surveillance photographs. He was watching her carefully. Taken over, best we can tell, the past 3 weeks. Outside this building, inside this building, different times of day. He turned the monitor back on and opened a different file. Not the security footage, but a series of document scans, clear enough that she could read them from where she sat. Every photograph was of her. Nora Callahan entering Harwick General at 6:43 in the morning. Nora Callahan in the parking structure, getting into a blue Honda Civic. Nora Callahan eating lunch in the hospital cafeteria with two other nurses. Nora Callahan leaving at the end of a night shift, 23 days ago, walking with her head down and her hands in her jacket pockets. 34 photographs. These were taken before today, Sims said. Weeks before today. Which suggests that whatever happened in that lobby this morning, it wasn't random. He let that land. You want to tell me if you recognize anyone who might have reason to surveil you? No, she said. Sims frowned. No, you don't recognize anyone. Or, no, she said again. I don't want to tell you. She stood up. I know how that sounds. I'm not trying to obstruct your investigation, but there are things here that are above your department's clearance level, and I'm being honest with you about that because I think you're a good detective, and I'd rather you hear it from me directly than waste days chasing a thread that's going to get cut before it goes anywhere useful. The room was very quiet. Sims stared at her. Above my clearance level, he said flatly. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Get the photographs to the FBI field office. Tell them they have a symbol on the lower right corner. She paused. Actually, don't tell them that on the phone. Tell them in person and make sure you have a witness when you do it. She walked out of the administrative office, and Sims sat there for a moment staring at the closed door. And then he looked down at the photographs on his monitor, and he leaned forward, and he found the lower right corner of the closest image. And there was indeed a symbol there, small, barely visible against the photo's border, the kind of thing that could be missed as a printing artifact or a smudge if you weren't looking for it. He'd never seen it before, but looking at it made him feel cold in a way he couldn't fully explain, the way you felt cold sometimes reading something you didn't understand but somehow knew was important. He picked up his phone and called his lieutenant. Check. Nora took a different route back to the floor. She moved through the hospital's service corridors, which she knew well enough that she didn't have to think about it, and she was thinking instead about the symbol. She hadn't seen it in 4 years. She hadn't expected to see it in Harwick, Virginia, on a Tuesday morning in a stack of surveillance photographs taken of her while she was walking to her car. She hadn't expected to see it ever again, was the honest version, but she'd also known, in the way that people know things they're trying not to know, that the expecting didn't really matter. Some things found you anyway. She pushed through a door into the main corridor of the 3rd floor and nearly walked into Callum Rask, who was standing just outside the elevator bank with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had also been doing some thinking. The shooter recognized you, he said. Nora stopped. What? Before you walked toward him, he recognized you. Not by name, I don't think, but he knew who you were. You could see it in the footage. He was going to fire at the desk clerk, and then you came through the stairwell door, and he stopped. Rask's jaw was tight. He was waiting for you. She processed that. You've already reviewed the footage. I've been in security work a long time, Nora. I move fast. He lowered his arms. The photographs in his car. You already know about them. Sims told me. Sims doesn't know what that symbol means. I think you do. She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the hospital moved. Nurses walking past, a cart being wheeled, the ambient noise of an institution that kept running regardless of what happened inside it. The fluorescent lights were slightly too bright, the way they always were, and in that light, Rask's face looked harder than it probably was. And Nora's looked more tired. You should go be with your team, she said. My team is fine. Wills is upstairs and stable, and currently arguing with his nurse about whether he can have solid food, which means he's recovering exactly on schedule. A pause. I want to know what that symbol means. I know you do. Then tell me. She shook her head, not dismissively, more like she was closing a door she'd been thinking about opening. If I'm right about what it means, then your team is safer if you don't know. I know that sounds like exactly what someone would say to get rid of you, but I'm being straight with you, Chief Rask. Walk away from this one. I don't walk away from... I know, she said. You're not built that way. None of you are. Her voice was even and unkind. But this isn't your operation, and the best thing you can do right now is let me handle what I can handle, and call the people you trust above your pay grade, and stay with your man until he's mobile. She walked away from him, and he let her, and she didn't look back. Room 412 was quiet. Derek Wills was asleep when Nora came in, which was normal and expected. He'd lost a significant amount of blood and been in surgery for 2 hours, and his body was doing what bodies did after that kind of trauma, which was shut down everything non-essential and focus on repair. She checked his vitals, checked the IV, checked the dressing on his thigh with the routine efficiency of someone who'd done this 10,000 times, and everything was exactly where it should be. She was writing in his chart when his eyes opened. "Hey," Will said. His voice was rough from the anesthesia. "You're the nurse from before, the one who asked about blood type." "I am," she said, not looking up. "How do you feel?" "Like someone shot me and then I went swimming." A pause. "They said the lobby thing happened." "It did." "They said you handled it." "The police handled it." "That's not what Cal says." He was quiet for a moment. "Cal doesn't say things like that about civilians." Nora set down the chart. She looked at Will's. Young, probably 27 or 28, a hard face gone soft with exhaustion, the look of someone who was still processing the gap between what had nearly happened and what had actually happened. He had a tattoo on his forearm she hadn't noticed before, military unit designation, and his hands, even at rest, had the particular stillness of trained hands. "Rest," she said. "Your argument about solid food can wait until tomorrow." Wills almost smiled. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "That thing you did, in the lobby, is that—" He stopped, started again. "Were you—" "I'm a nurse," Nora said. "Yeah," Wills said. "Sure." His eyes were drifting. "You know what's funny? I've seen guys twice your size freeze in situations like that. I've done it myself, once. Came out of it, but—" He was losing the sentence to sleep. "You didn't look scared at all." "I told him I was," she said. "Were you?" She thought about the 3 seconds after she'd come through the stairwell door. The assessment, the calculation, the choice. The way the lobby had looked from that angle, and the way the shooter's body had telegraphed everything he was going to do next before he'd done any of it, and the feeling she'd had walking toward him. Not fearlessness, exactly, but something closer to clarity. "Yes," she said. "A little." Wills was already asleep. Nora stood in the room for another moment. She looked out the window at the Harwick skyline, the low buildings and the mountains in the distance and the flat gray sky of an October afternoon. And she turned something over in her mind that she'd been turning since she'd seen the symbol in Sims's photographs. Trying to decide what it meant, and what it meant that it had found her here, after 4 years, after all the careful and deliberate distance she'd put between herself and everything that symbol represented. She was walking back to the nurse's station when her pager went off. She looked down at it. The message was internal, the hospital's system, a standard code. She read it twice because the first time she read it, she thought she'd misread it. Then she turned and walked back down the corridor to room 412 at a pace just short of running. The room was empty. Not empty the way a room became empty when a patient was transferred to another floor or taken for imaging, empty the wrong way. The IV line was still connected to the stand and dangling loose at the catheter end, disconnected from the patient. The sheet was pushed back. The call button was on the floor. Derek Wills was gone. Nora stood in the door and looked at the empty bed for exactly 2 seconds. Then she looked at the window. Closed, 4th floor, no access. Then she looked at the bathroom. Empty. She walked to the IV line and looked at the catheter end. Clean disconnection. Deliberate. She looked at the call button on the floor and crouched and saw that it hadn't been dropped. The cord had been cut. She stood up. She went back to the door. Taped to the inside of the door frame at exactly her eye level was a square of paper approximately 3 inches by 3 inches. On it, in block handwriting, were 4 words. "You know where, come alone." And in the lower right corner of the paper, the same symbol from the surveillance photographs, now close enough that she could see every detail of it, could see it the way she had first seen it 12 years ago, in a facility that didn't officially exist, on a document she wasn't supposed to have seen, on the first day she'd understood that the world had more layers than most people ever learned about. Nora took the note off the door frame. She folded it. She put it in her scrubs pocket. She pulled out her phone and looked at the screen for a moment, and then she put it away without making a call, and she looked once more at the empty room, the abandoned IV line, the pushed-back sheet, the severed call cord, and her expression was not afraid. It was something much more complicated than that, She stood there for another 3 seconds, looking at the empty room, and then she made a decision she'd been trying not to make since the moment she'd seen the symbol in Sim's photographs. She walked to the nurse's station and told the charge nurse, a competent woman named Paula, that room 412 needed immediate review. Patient missing, security needed now, call the attending. She said it in a voice that was flat and factual and gave nothing away. And she watched Paula's face shift from confusion to alarm and pick up the phone. And Nora turned and walked to the stairwell because she needed 30 seconds alone before this became something she couldn't control. The stairwell was cold and smelled like concrete and cleaning solution. She stood on the third-floor landing and put her back against the wall and breathed. In through the nose, out slow. Not panic management. She wasn't panicking. It was something more deliberate than that. It was the thing she did when she needed to separate what she felt from what she needed to do. And right now, those two things were pointing in completely different directions. What she felt, the specific, deep-seated dread of someone who had spent 4 years building a quiet life and had just watched it crack down the middle in a single afternoon. What she needed to do, think. The symbol belonged to a network that went by several names in the operational circles she'd once moved through, but the name most people used internally was the Lattice. It wasn't a government program exactly. It wasn't a private organization exactly. It existed in the space between those things, funded through channels that didn't appear in any budget document she'd ever seen, staffed by people who were officially employed elsewhere, running operations that were officially not happening. She had been part of it for 3 years, between the ages of 24 and 27, after a recruitment process so gradual she hadn't fully understood what she was signing until she was already inside it. She had left. That was the simple version. The real version was longer and uglier and involved a mission in a city she still couldn't think about without a particular kind of tiredness settling into her chest, and a decision she'd made that her handlers had called insubordination and she'd called the only thing she could live with. Either way, the outcome was the same. She had walked away, and the Lattice had let her walk, and she had built Harwick and the Blue Scrubs and the 6 years of Tuesday mornings and Virgil arguing about parking permits and all of it, every piece of it, on the assumption that walking away had been enough. The note in her pocket said it hadn't been. She pushed off the wall and went back up. The hospital reacted to Will's disappearance the way institutions reacted to unexpected crises, with a wave of coordinated activity that was 90% process and 10% actual usefulness. Security locked down the exits, which was closing a gate after the horse had been gone for 20 minutes. Administration called the police, who arrived to find Callum Rask had already pulled his remaining 2 team members from wherever they'd stationed themselves and had them running a physical sweep of the building with the quiet, methodical efficiency of people who did not need a coordinator to tell them how to search a building. Nora found Rask in the 4th-floor corridor outside room 412, standing in the doorway looking at the empty bed with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself. The expression of someone absorbing a situation that was worse than they'd expected and calculating forward from that. "Security footage?" she asked. "Cameras on this floor went dark at 3:47, Rask said. 8-minute gap. Came back on at 3:55. He didn't turn around. "Professional job. How many people?" "At least 2, based on the logistics. Will's is ambulatory but compromised. They needed someone to move him and someone to manage the corridor." He turned then and looked at her. This wasn't opportunistic. Someone knew he was here, knew the floor layout, knew the camera positions. This was planned before we even arrived this morning. "I know," Nora said. His eyes sharpened. "You know." They didn't come for Will's because of who Will's is. She kept her voice low, not from fear, but from the awareness that there were now 3 uniformed officers in the corridor, and she didn't want this conversation overheard. They came for Will's because of who he was with. Rask stared at her. "You." "Me." She reached into her scrubs pocket and unfolded the note and held it out to him. He read it. His jaw did something complicated. "You know where," he said. "Yes." "Where?" She took the note back. "That's the part I can't tell you." The sound he made was controlled, just barely. She could see him doing what she'd done in the stairwell, which was separate his reaction from what he needed to do next, and she appreciated the discipline of it even under the circumstances. "Nora, they have one of my men." "I know." "So you're going to tell me where this location is?" "No." She said it the same way she said most things, evenly, without apology. Because if I tell you and you move on it with your team, two things happen. First, whoever is running this operation sees you coming because they will have surveillance on the approach, and they will move wills before you get inside, and then you have a compromised extraction and a mobile target. Second, she paused. Second is worse. He waited. The people who have him aren't afraid of your team, she said. They trained half the operators currently working in this country. They will not respond to a tactical approach the way a normal kidnapping situation responds to a tactical approach. Rask was quiet for a moment. Who are these people? You don't have the clearance for that question. I don't... He stopped himself, breathed. He's 26 years old. He has a daughter. Nora absorbed that. She'd known the mission details would have that kind of weight in them somewhere. They always did. But hearing it out loud made something tighten in her chest in a way she didn't have time for right now. She filed it away. She'd deal with it later. I'm going to need you to trust me, she said. I don't know you. No, you don't. She held his gaze. But you've been watching me since this morning, and you're good at reading people. And what are you reading right now? A long pause. The corridor around them had its usual hospital ambient noise, the distant sound of monitors, the soft tread of staff, something wheeled past the far end. Rask looked at her with those gray, evaluating eyes, and she stood still and let him look. I'm reading someone who is more afraid of the right things than the wrong ones, he said finally. Then give me space to do what I need to do, she said. And in the meantime, make that call, the one to whoever you trust above your pay grade. Tell them what happened here. Tell them, she thought for a second. Tell them you saw the lattice symbol. Use that exact word, lattice. They'll know what it means. She left him in the doorway and went back to work, because the floor still needed nurses, and the world didn't stop moving because her life had just gotten significantly more complicated. Detective Sims called her at 5:20. She took the call in the medication room, which was the closest thing to private she was going to get for the next several hours. Miss Callahan, Sims said. He sounded different than he had in the security office, tighter, like someone had turned a dial half a rotation. I took your advice. About the FBI. Okay, she said. 2 agents from the Richmond field office arrived here at 4:15. I showed them the photographs and told them in person about the symbol, like you said, with my partner as witness. A pause. They asked me where you were. Nora leaned against the medication shelf. What did you tell them? I told them you were on the floor. They said they wanted to speak with you. Another pause, longer. Then one of them made a phone call, and when she came back, they said they didn't need to speak with you after all. They took the photographs and left. The room was very quiet. Both agents? Nora said. Both of them. They had credentials, I checked. Real Richmond field office, real badges. But the way they left, she heard him shift. I've been doing this job for 11 years. Something was off. It was, she said. Thank you for telling me. What's off? Sims asked. What am I looking at here? Because I've got a missing Navy operator and a nurse who disarmed a gunman this morning and told me my department doesn't have the clearance for her stalker situation. And now FBI agents are acting weird. And I'm starting to think this Tuesday is going to be in my memoir. Nora almost smiled, which surprised her. Garrett, she said, using his first name without thinking about it. Go home tonight. Don't do any additional work on the photographs. Don't run the symbol through any databases. Don't put anything in writing about what we talked about. That sounds extremely like advice I should not take. It's advice that keeps you and your family out of something you don't want to be in. She paused. I'm not threatening you. I'm being straight. Silence on the line. Then, are you going to be okay? The question caught her slightly off guard. Not because it was a strange question, but because of the particular, uncomplicated human concern behind it. The way it came from a place that had nothing to do with strategy or assessment. Just a man who'd spent a day watching something unusual unfold and had landed on basic decency as his response. Probably, she said, which was the honest answer. She ended the call and stood in the medication room for a moment, and then she pulled out the folded note and looked at it again. You know where. Come alone. She did know where. There was only one location it could mean, only one place that the symbol would point to for her, only one site that connected her history with the lattice in a way that would be legible to whoever was sending this message. The Trevick compound, 47 miles northwest of Harwick, off a state road that didn't show up on most maps, on a stretch of Virginia mountain land that had been officially decommissioned and officially empty for 9 years. She had spent 7 months there when she was 25 years old. She knew every corridor, every exit, every approach. She also knew that whoever had sent this note was counting on exactly that. He's expecting me. That's exactly why he'll lose. She thought that, and then she thought, don't get ahead of yourself. At 6 o'clock, the evening shift came on, and Nora handed off her remaining patients. She did it thoroughly, and without hurry, gave the incoming nurse a proper handover for every single person on her board, the kind that left nothing out and nothing ambiguous, because whatever happened next, these people deserved continuity of care, and that was not something she was willing to cut corners on. She was putting on her jacket at her locker when Callum Rask appeared at the end of the staff corridor. He wasn't alone. There was a woman with him, late 40s, trim, dark blazer, the particular bearing of someone who carried federal authority as a matter of daily routine and had stopped noticing it. Her hair was silver at the temples, and her eyes were quick, and she looked at Nora the way the FBI agents in Sims' account had probably not looked at Sims, like she was seeing someone she recognized. "Nora Callahan," the woman said. "Yes," Nora said. "My name is Deputy Director Adrienne Kolb, Defense Intelligence Agency." She didn't offer a hand. "We need to talk." Nora zipped her jacket. "I'm aware." Aware that I was coming specifically, or aware in the general sense? General sense. She looked at Rask. He had the expression of a man who had made the call she'd told him to make and had gotten a faster response than he'd expected. "You moved quickly," she said to him. "I had a name to give them," he said. "Lattice." "You were right. It cut through a lot of hold music." Kolb stepped forward slightly, not crowding but establishing priority. "Ms. Callahan, you understand the gravity of what happened today." "I do." "The photographs in the shooter's vehicle have been analyzed by our team. The symbol is confirmed Lattice origin. The Marcus Delvane situation is being handled at a level above local law enforcement." Her voice was efficient, clipped, not unkind, but not particularly warm either. "What concerns me right now is the note from room 412. Nora looked at her steadily. "How do you know about the note?" A slight pause. "Chief Rask?" "I didn't tell Rask about the note," Nora said. The corridor was very quiet. Rask's expression hadn't changed, which was, she thought, either a good sign or a very practiced one. Kolb's expression was unreadable in a way that took effort to maintain. "The room was swept by my team when they arrived," Kolb said. "The adhesive residue on the doorframe was noted." "You swept the room before talking to me," Nora said. "Okay." She processed that, what it meant about sequencing, about what Kolb's priorities actually were, about how long the DIA had been moving on this. "How long have you known the Lattice was active in this area?" "That's not my clearance level, I know." Nora picked up her bag. "Deputy Director, I'm going to go home tonight, and I'm going to think carefully about what the note means and what my options are, and tomorrow morning I will be back here at 6:30 because I have a shift in people who need care." She looked at Kolb directly. "What I'm not going to do is tell you the location in the note, because you would move on it immediately, which would get Derek Wills killed or moved before you could extract him, because whoever is running this operation will have eyes on every approach within 20 miles of that facility." Kolb stared at her. "You know the location?" "Yes." "And you won't share it?" "Not yet." "Ms. Callahan." Kolb's voice dropped slightly, not softer but lower, the register of someone saying something they'd decided to say carefully. "I understand you have history with the Lattice. I understand you have reasons to manage this on your own terms. But Derek Wills is a United States military operator, and we have a responsibility." "Who trained the team that ran the operation at Kessler?" Nora said. Kolb went very still. "Kessler," Nora said again. 2019. The operation that was classified before the dust settled. 6 operators went in and 2 came out, and the official report said equipment failure, and everyone who knew better was told to know better somewhere private. She watched Kolb's face. "I know who trained that team, and I know who signed off on the mission parameters, and I know that if you move on the Trevik—" She stopped herself, one syllable too late. Kolb's eyes moved, precise and fast. "Trevik," she said quietly. Nora felt the small, cold weight of the error. It had been one word, one syllable. She'd been more careful than this in rooms with more pressure than this. But she'd also been running on adrenaline since 9:14 this morning, and she was, in the end, a person and not a machine. And people slipped. She held Kolb's gaze and said nothing else. Kolb looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Rask, and something passed between them that Nora couldn't fully parse. And Kolb said, "I'll need you available tomorrow morning, 7 o'clock. We'll talk about a joint approach." 6:30, Nora said. "I have rounds first." Something that might have been surprise moved across Kolb's face, and might have been something close to respect right behind it. And she nodded once and turned and walked back down the corridor, and her footsteps were even and unhurried and gave nothing away. Rask stayed. "I didn't tell her about the note," he said. "I know," Nora said. She swept the room and found the adhesive. She was telling the truth about that part. She looked at him. "She was lying about being here because of your call." Rask didn't argue it. "How long have they been watching you?" "I genuinely don't know," Nora said, and that was the truest thing she'd said all day. And it was also the most frightening. She'd spent 6 years building the assumption that she was under nobody's radar, that the distance she'd put between herself and the lattice had been enough, that the quiet life was real and not a grace period. The DIA being here, moving this fast, knowing to pull the room before talking to her, that didn't read like a response to today, that read like a structure that had been in place for a while, waiting. She went home. The drive took 22 minutes, and she spent most of it checking the rearview mirror out of a habit she'd never fully shed, and her small apartment on Fenwick Street was exactly as she'd left it at 6 that morning. Dishes from the night before still drying on the rack, a library book on the coffee table, the particular still air of a space where someone lived alone and kept things orderly out of preference rather than performance. She didn't turn on the lights immediately. She stood in the dark hallway and listened to the apartment, the way it settled and breathed, and she checked the 3 things she checked every time she came home. The piece of tape on the closet door, the position of the chair she always left at a specific angle, the small mark on the window frame. All present, all undisturbed. She let herself breathe. She made tea because that was what she did when she needed to think, and she sat at the kitchen table with the note flattened on the wood in front of her and the tea she wasn't really drinking cooling in the mug, and she thought about Trevik, about the compound, about every approach and every exit and every corridor she'd memorized 12 years ago. About who could have sent this. There was really only one answer, one person who would know the symbol, know Harwick, know her, know to use wills as leverage, know that she'd see a single note and immediately know the location it pointed to. Only one person who had taught her to read the world in exactly that way in the first place. She'd hoped he was dead. She'd spent 4 years in some fraction of her private mental energy, hoping that, in the uncomplicated way you hoped for things that would make your life simpler. But she'd known, the way you know things, that he wasn't. She was still sitting at the table when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Not a call, a text. 3 words and an image. The image was a photograph taken less than an hour ago. It showed her kitchen table from the angle of the window. The tea. The note. Her hands in the frame at the bottom. The 3 words said, "I see you," and somewhere in the building or just outside it or close enough to take that photograph through her window, someone was watching her right now. And the tape on the closet door and the angled chair and the window mark hadn't mattered at all. Nora put the phone face down on the table. Not because she was afraid of the photograph, because she needed 10 seconds to make a decision she couldn't unmake, and looking at it wasn't going to help her make it faster. She counted. She breathed. She picked the phone back up. The photograph was taken from outside, which meant either a zoom lens from street level or someone on a building across the alley. The apartment complex on Weller was 4 stories and had roof access through an unsecured maintenance door she'd noted when she moved in, and then filed away under unlikely but possible. The angle was slightly elevated. Roof, then. The image was sharp enough for a decent lens, but not professional surveillance equipment, which told her something about the resources being deployed or, more likely, about the message being sent. This wasn't showing her capability. This was showing her reach. "I see you" meant, "We've had eyes on you longer than today." It meant, "Your precautions were noted and bypassed." It meant, "The tape on the closet door was never going to be enough." It also meant whoever sent it wanted her scared and isolated, which meant they needed her scared and isolated, which meant they were not in fact operating from a position of total control. She thought about that for a moment. Then she stood up, moved to the window, and pulled the blind down. She carried her tea to the hallway, sat on the floor with her back against the wall where she was out of any possible sightline, and called Callum Rask. He picked up on the second ring. "Someone's been watching my apartment," she said. "I don't know how long. I need to move tonight." A pause, short. "Where are you now?" "Inside. Hallway. I'm clear. Don't go out the front." She heard movement on his end, the quick, efficient sounds of someone already in motion. "Give me the address. I'll have someone at your back entrance in 8 minutes." She gave him the address. He hung up without unnecessary conversation, which she appreciated. She spent those 8 minutes doing what she could do. She changed out of her scrubs into dark clothes, packed a bag with the things she actually needed, which was less than most people would have taken. A change of clothes, her medical kit, the secure phone she kept in the false bottom of her go bag that she'd hoped never to need again. She looked around her apartment once, at the library book and the drying dishes and the life she'd built here piece by piece over 6 careful years, and she felt something about that, something she didn't have the vocabulary for right now and didn't need, and she put it away and went to the back door. The man outside was one of Rask's. She recognized him from the lobby, the one who'd secured the rifle. He had a rental car running 10 feet from the door, and he didn't speak when she came out, just scanned the alleyway in both directions and held the rear door, and that was all the conversation necessary. She got in and didn't look back at the building. They used a hotel 3 miles from the hospital, the kind with exterior corridor access and multiple exit routes, which she suspected Rask had chosen for exactly those reasons. He was waiting in the room when she arrived, along with Adrienne Kolb, which was not what she'd expected, and a third person she hadn't seen before. A man in his 50s, salt and pepper hair, civilian clothes that were doing a poor job of concealing a federal bearing, sitting in the corner with a laptop, and a stillness that suggested he'd been in rooms like this many times and found them unremarkable. "You moved fast," Nora said to Kolb. "You called Rask instead of me," Kolb said. "He called me." "Fair," Nora said. She sat. She looked at the man with the laptop. "Who are you?" "Erickson," he said. "NSA liaison." He turned the laptop to face her. "We pulled satellite imagery of the Trevik property at 2200 hours, 30 minutes ago." She looked at the screen. The imagery was recent. She could read the timestamp in the corner, 6 hours old. The compound sat in a natural bowl in the mountain terrain, ringed by tree line, access road cutting north to south. 3 structures: the main building, the secondary ops building, and the equipment barn. Even at satellite resolution, she could see that the main building had light and 2 windows, and the access road had vehicle tracks pressed into the mud that weren't there in the 6-month-old comparative image Erickson had overlaid on the right side of the screen. "Active," she said. "Active," Erickson confirmed. "Heat signatures consistent with 4 to 6 individuals inside the main building. 1 signature isolated in the secondary ops structure, which, based on your compound knowledge, would be where they're holding him," she said. "The secondary ops building has 2 rooms with exterior locks. Holds 1 person, easy. 3 if you're not worried about comfort." Kolb leaned forward. "We can have a tactical team at the perimeter by 0400. Full dark, low signature." "No," Nora said. "Ms. Callahan, I'll explain this once, Deputy Director." She kept her voice even, but not gentle. "Trevik has a passive alert system that was installed in 2016 and was not officially decommissioned because the decommissioning was not official. It runs on ground vibration sensors buried on every approach, all 4 compass directions, 200-meter radius. You will not get a 4-person team to the perimeter without triggering every alarm in that building." She looked at Erickson. "Your satellite won't show you the sensors because they're 6 inches underground and they're ceramic, not metal." Erickson typed something. "How do you know about the sensors?" "I helped design the placement pattern." The room was quiet. Rask, who had been standing near the window, said, "Is there an approach that doesn't trigger them?" "One," she said. "There's a drainage channel on the northwest side that runs under the sensor line. It's 60 meters long and 18 inches wide, and it runs with about 4 inches of cold water in October." She looked at him. "It fits 1 person." "You're not going in alone," Rask said. The note said alone. The note was written by someone who wants you isolated and compliant. Going in alone is what they want. Going in with a team is what gets Wills killed, she said. I know how this works. I have sat in rooms where this exact calculus was made. The moment they see a tactical approach, Wills becomes a liability instead of a hostage. That happens fast. She looked at Kolb. You know I'm right. Kolb's jaw was tight. I know you're describing standard protocol for this type of operation. I also know that sending a civilian nurse into an active hostile compound is... I'm not a civilian nurse, Nora said. I'm a nurse. That part's accurate. The rest isn't. She looked at her hands on the table. I need you to trust me with the approach. I need you to have your team ready at the perimeter. Not moving, not advancing, ready for my signal. I need communications equipment that doesn't emit on standard frequencies because they'll be scanning those. She looked at Erickson. Can you get me something that runs on... I know what you need, Erickson said, and for the first time he sounded like something other than a technician. He sounded like someone who had worked these problems before. Give me 2 hours. You have one, she said. We need to move before 4. Another silence. Kolb and Rask exchanged a look that she didn't have the exact translation for but understood in broad strokes. Two people deciding whether to trust someone in a situation where the cost of not trusting her was clearly higher than the cost of trusting her. It wasn't comfortable, it wasn't tidy. But it was, she thought, the right conclusion, and after another moment Kolb nodded. 1 hour, Kolb said. And Nora. She paused. If this goes wrong... I know, Nora said. Let's not let it go wrong. She used the hour well. Erickson produced a communications unit the size of a stack of cards that ran on a frequency band she recognized from work she'd done in 2017, and that wasn't listed in any publicly available spectrum guide. She tested it twice in the bathroom with the water running, confirmed the signal path, clipped it to the inside of her jacket. Rask's team gave her a vest that was thinner than standard and would stop a handgun round from 10 feet. She put it on without commentary. She ate half a protein bar because she hadn't eaten since noon, and she was going to need blood sugar to operate at altitude in cold water, and she drank a full bottle of water for the same reason, and she sat for 5 minutes in the bathroom alone and did nothing except breathe and remember. She remembered Trevik the way you remember a place you've spent months inside. Not as a floor plan, but as a felt experience. The way the main building's entrance creaked on the left hinge. The way the secondary ops building had a gap under the east wall where the foundation had settled. The way sound traveled differently in the bowl terrain, bouncing off the slope so that noise from the north sounded like it came from the east and vice versa, which had confused her first 3 weeks there, and then become something she factored automatically. She remembered the man who had taught her to factor it. She didn't let herself think about him directly. Not yet. The drive to the access point took 40 minutes. Rask drove. Kolb was in the passenger seat, Erickson in the back with her, monitoring satellite feeds on a tablet with the screen dimmed low. They didn't talk much. Outside the windows, the Virginia mountains resolved out of the dark in gradual stages. The highway, then the state route, then a road that wasn't a road anymore, barely a track through undergrowth with the ghost of gravel under the tires. Rask stopped the car where the track bent and the terrain dropped. Sensor line starts 200 meters ahead, Nora said. The drainage channel entrance is through those trees, bearing 275. You'll see the concrete culvert opening. She looked at Rask. Do not advance past the sensor line. I mean that. Understood, he said. He looked like he was going to say something else, and then didn't. She got out. The air was cold and smelled like wet earth and pine and the specific mineral quality of mountain drainage. And her breath misted once, and then she controlled it, in through the nose, measured. She moved through the tree line without using the light, because she didn't need it here, and found the culvert opening where she'd said it would be. Concrete collar half buried in the bank, the sound of slow water audible inside. She got down. She went in. 18 inches of space and 4 inches of water running at about 46 degrees, which was not going to be comfortable but was not going to incapacitate her either. She'd trained in worse. She moved on her elbows and her knees, keeping her head low, and the water soaked through her clothes in the first 10 seconds, and she let it and kept moving. The culvert ran 60 meters. She counted her way through it. Not seconds, because stress altered time perception, but physical landmarks she remembered. The crack in the concrete at the 20-meter mark, the slight leftward bend at 40, the tree root that had broken through the top of the channel at 52, and then the end, the concrete giving way to open drainage channel with 8 inches of clearance below a wooden equipment platform. She stopped at the channel end, listened. The compound above her was quiet in the way active places were quiet at 3 in the morning. Not empty, just still. She could hear the hum of a generator from the equipment barn. She could see light from 2 windows in the main building, consistent with the satellite imagery. And she could hear, from the secondary ops building approximately 30 meters to her northeast, the particular silence of a space that held someone who was trying not to make sound. She pulled herself out of the drainage channel, silent, and moved. The secondary ops building door had an exterior hasp lock and a padlock that was, she saw when she got close, a model she'd seen before. A Brenton 480. She'd been trained to open one in 40 seconds. In the dark and wet, it took her 63, and she counted every second because she was listening for the sensor response that would mean she'd been wrong about the drainage channel, and there was none. She opened the door. Derek Wills was on the floor on the left side of the room, wrists zip-tied behind him, ankles tied, a strip of medical tape over his mouth that she could see him breathing hard through. He was conscious. He looked terrible, pale, sweating, the post-surgical pallor compounded by stress and cold, and whatever they'd given him to move him, which, judging by his pupil response, had been a sedative that was still partially metabolizing. His thigh dressing had stayed intact, which was something. He saw her come in, and his eyes went wide and she held up a hand, quiet. She crouched next to him and cut the ankle restraints with the small knife she'd taken from Rask's kit, then the wrists. He moved his hands in front of him and she saw him wince at the shoulder rotation and catalog it and push past it in the space of about 2 seconds, which was the kind of thing operators did with pain and which she noted because it was relevant to whether he could move on his own. She pulled the tape from his mouth, slow, because fast was louder. "Can you walk?" she breathed directly in his ear. "Yeah," he breathed back. "Yeah," he breathed back. His voice was wrecked. "My leg. I know. We'll go slow." She put her mouth back to his ear. "There's a culvert, northwest side. I'm going to take you through it. 30 seconds of it is going to be very cold and I need you to stay quiet through that. Can you do that?" She felt him nod. "Is there anyone in this building besides us?" A head shake. "How many total in the main building?" He held up 4 fingers, then wavered, then held up 5. 5 in the main. 1 unknown on the perimeter, maybe, given that someone had photographed her apartment, though that person might be here now. She built the picture in her head. 5 inside. Will's compromised but mobile. 60 meters of culvert. Rask's team at the perimeter with orders she hoped they'd hold. She helped Wills to his feet. He was heavier than she was, and a foot taller, and he was not, in his current state, moving smoothly. She got his left arm over her shoulders and took his weight on her right side, and he did his part, which was putting effort into his steps rather than leaning on her entirely, and they moved to the door. She checked the gap. Clear. They went. The 30 meters to the culvert entrance was the most exposed part of the approach, and she'd known that going in. Wills was slower than she'd hoped. His surgical leg was bearing weight, but not freely, and he was dragging it slightly, and the sound of that drag on the grass was manageable but not nothing. She kept them low and close to the equipment barn's shadow line, which put them in darkness for 2/3 of the distance, and then the last 10 meters were open and she moved them through it without pausing, because hesitation in open ground was worse than speed. The culvert entrance. She got down first, showed him what to expect inside, watched his face process the space in the water and make the decision that all operators eventually made in situations like this, which was that discomfort was not a factor. He went in. She went in behind him. He was slower through the culvert than she'd been alone. Expected. At the 40-meter mark, he stopped for a second, just one, and she heard his breathing change and she put her hand on his ankle ahead of her and pressed once. "Keep going." He kept going. The crack in the concrete at 20, the bend at 40, the root at 52. And then they were out, in the tree line, and she was pressing the comms unit through her soaked jacket and clicking it 3 times for clear and waiting. Rask's voice came back immediately. "Copy. Moving." She felt something unclench in her chest that had been clenched since 9:14 that morning. They were 40 meters from the sensor line when the main building's front door opened. She heard it. the creak of the left hinge exactly as she remembered. And she pulled Wills down into the undergrowth without thinking, both of them flat, and she tracked the sound. Footsteps on the wooden porch. One person, stopping, and then the particular quality of silence that meant someone standing and listening. She didn't breathe. Wills didn't breathe. 20 seconds. 30. The footsteps went back inside. The door closed. She gave it another 10 seconds, and then they were moving again, and Rask's team materialized out of the darkness at the sensor line. 4 of them, one grabbing Wills before he could fall, and 2 spreading wide on the flanks, and Rask himself coming straight to her with something in his expression she couldn't read in the dark. "We need to move," she said. "They'll do a check on the secondary building in—" "Nora," Rask said. 30 minutes, maybe less. "Nora." He said it the way he'd said her name in the hospital corridor. Just direct, just her name with the weight of something behind it. "There's a vehicle coming up the North Access Road. Kolb's people picked it up on infrared 2 minutes ago. Single vehicle, moving slow." She processed that. A vehicle coming in, not going out. At 3:30 in the morning. "Who?" she said. "We don't know yet, but Kolb wants you at the staging point before it arrives." She said. He paused in a way that told her he was about to relay something he disagreed with. "She said to tell you that the asset we discussed is on site." Nora went still. "What asset?" she said. Rask shook his head. "She wouldn't say over comms, but she said you'd understand what it meant when you heard it." He looked at her in the dark. "Do you?" She thought about what asset Kolb would bring to a Lattice operation site at 3:30 in the morning in a single vehicle. Thought about who could walk into Trevik without triggering a response, who the people inside that compound would open a door for, who Kolb would use as a key if she'd had a key available. Only one answer. "Yes," Nora said, very quietly. "I understand." She didn't say anything else. She moved. Rask moved with her, Wills between them supported on the stronger side, and the team collapsed around them, and they covered the distance to the staging point in 4 minutes of hard movement through cold mountain undergrowth. The vehicle on the North Road was still moving slow. She tracked its progress through Ericsson's tablet when she reached the staging point. A sedan, one occupant visible on infrared, taking the road carefully in the dark. Kolb was at the staging vehicle with her arms crossed, and an expression that told Nora she'd been making decisions in the last hour that she wasn't certain were correct. "Tell me," Nora said. "We had contact 6 days ago from someone inside the Lattice network," Kolb said. "A voluntary contact. He said he wanted to come in. He gave us Harwick, gave us the hospital as the approach point, gave us the date." She held Nora's gaze. "He asked us to use you as the convergence point. Specifically, you." Nora's throat was tight, because he knew I'd come. Because he said you were the only one he trusted to— Kolb stopped. Started again. He said, "She will understand why I did it. She's the only one who will." The vehicle on the access road had stopped 200 meters from the compound. On the infrared, the single occupant sat for a moment without moving. Then the door opened. The person who stepped out was tall, white-haired, moving with the deliberate care of a man in his 60s who was carrying something heavier than physical weight. He stood next to the car and looked toward the tree line with the stillness of someone who had spent his life knowing when he was being watched. He raised one hand. Not a wave. Just an acknowledgement. "His name," Kolb said carefully, "is Victor Hale." Nora had not heard that name spoken aloud in 4 years. She had not allowed herself to say it, or think it directly, or follow any of the threads that led back to it, because the threads all led back to a man who had built her and broken her, and who she had left in the wreckage of a decision that had cost her everything she'd been before Harwick. A man who had been the architect of the Lattice's training apparatus for 20 years. A man who had put the symbol on those photographs not as a threat, but she now understood with the cold clarity of 3:30 in the morning, as a signal. Not "I see you, I need you to see me." "He designed the Trevik compound," she said. "Yes," Kolb said. "Which means he also knows where every sensor is buried." "Yes." "Which means he drove in from the north without triggering a single alarm." She paused. "And the people inside that building, they're not his people. They're Lattice, but not his faction. He's not the one who took Wills." "No," Kolb said. "He's not. He says he came here to stop them. And he says the man running the operation inside that compound, the one who coordinated the hospital attack, the photographs, all of it, is someone called Dorian Price. Nora went very still. She knew that name. She knew it the way you knew the specific face of a moment that had changed the shape of your life. Not with fondness, not with fear exactly, but with the absolute concrete certainty of a person who had been inside a room with him and had walked out with a different understanding of what human beings were capable of choosing to become. Dorian Price had been the Lattice's operational director in 2019. He had designed the Kessler mission. He had put 6 operators into a compromised site and brought 2 of them out, and when the after-action review had started to point in his direction, he had buried it. She knew this because she had been the one to find the evidence. She had brought it to her handler, and her handler had told her to close the file, and she had refused, and that refusal was the reason she was standing in a Virginia mountain forest at 3:30 in the morning wearing someone else's vest with river water still in her boots. "He's inside," she said. "We believe so," Kolb said, "based on Victor Hale's intelligence." Victor Hale, who designed the training program that made Price what he is. Kolb was quiet. Victor Hale, who ran Lattice recruitment for 15 years and personally vetted every person who moved through that pipeline, including Price. She heard her own voice, steady, which surprised her slightly. "He's not coming in out of remorse, Deputy Director. He's coming in because Price has gone past whatever line Hale drew for himself, and Hale needs us to clean it up before it comes back to him." "That may be true," Kolb said. "It doesn't change whether his intelligence is accurate." "No," Nora said. "It doesn't." Outside the staging vehicle's circle, in the dark at the tree line's edge, Victor Hale stood next to his car, with his hand lowered now, waiting. She could see him from where she stood. He was looking directly at the staging point, which meant he couldn't see her specifically, but knew she was there, knew she had been the one to pull Wills out of the secondary building, knew she had come just like the note said she would. She hadn't decided yet what she felt about that. What she knew was this. Dorian Price was inside a compound she understood better than anyone alive, except the man standing at the tree line. Price had orchestrated the hospital attack, had used Marcus Delvain as a delivery mechanism, and Wills as a pressure point, had spent weeks photographing her, and had sent an agent to her apartment window with a lens and a message designed to make her feel cornered and alone. He had done all of this with the specific precision of someone who knew her well enough to predict her, and there was only one way to know her that well. He had read the same file Hale had written, the file that didn't exist in any official system, but that the Lattice kept on everyone who had ever moved through its structure and then walked away. He wanted her afraid. She stood in the wet clothes and the cold and the specific exhaustion of a woman who had been running on adrenaline since before breakfast, and she looked at the compound on Erickson's tablet. The 2 lit windows, the heat signatures, the access road with a single vehicle parked 200 meters short of the sensor line, and she made a decision. "I need to talk to Hale," she said. "Nora, I know." She looked at Kolb. "I know every risk you're about to name. I'm not dismissing them. But Victor Hale knows the interior of that compound. He knows Price's operational patterns, and whatever his reasons for being here, his intelligence is the difference between a tactical approach that works and one that gets people killed." She paused. "Give me 10 minutes with him." Kolb looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Rask, who was standing 2 feet away with Derek Wills now in the hands of the medic Kolb's team had staged, and Rask said nothing, which was, Nora thought, its own kind of answer. 10 minutes, Kolb said. Nora walked toward the tree line. Victor Hale watched her come. He didn't move, didn't adjust his posture, didn't do any of the things that people did when they were bracing for a confrontation. He stood the way he'd always stood, loose, centered, with the particular quality of stillness that she had once, a long time ago, mistaken for peace, and had later understood was something more like the absence of doubt. She stopped 6 feet from him. He looked older than she'd expected, thinner in the face. His hair had gone fully white, and there was something in the set of his shoulders that hadn't been there 9 years ago, a weight that was either age or consequence and might have been both. His eyes were the same, though, careful, precise, reading her the way they'd always read her, with the particular attention of someone who had spent his life deciding what people were made of. "You look like a nurse," he said. "I am a nurse," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not what I meant." He paused. "You look good, Nora." You look like someone who figured out who she is. Don't, she said. Not angry, just clear. He nodded. Let that go. Price has 7 people in that building, he said, not 5. 2 of them aren't on the thermal profile because they're in the basement level, which isn't on any official schematic because it was added in 2018. I added it. She absorbed that. What's in the basement? Communications array. He's been running the Lattice's Eastern Corridor operations from Trevik for 4 months. His voice was even. The hospital today wasn't about you specifically, not at first. It was about burning a resource before it could talk. Marcus Delvane was one of his own, a courier who had started having doubts. Using you as the apparent target was Price's way of sending 2 messages at once. He looked at her steadily. He knew about you. He's known where you were for 2 years. He never moved on it until now because you weren't a threat while you were quiet. What changed? She said. I did, Hale said. When I made contact with your deputy director 6 days ago, Price's people intercepted the communication. He couldn't know what I gave them, but he knew I'd gone outside, and he knew that you were the reason I'd decided to. He paused. Because you were right. In 2000... When you closed the Kessler file and walked away, you were right, and I told you to close the file, and I have spent 4 years knowing that and not doing anything about it. The forest was very cold and very quiet. Somewhere above them, the mountain had no idea any of this was happening, which was, she thought, the usual condition of mountains. 7 people, she said. Basement-level comms. What else? There's a secondary exit, Hale said. South wall, the equipment barn. There's a tunnel that runs 40 meters under the access road and comes up inside the barn. Price built it as a final exfil route. He looked at her. He will use it if he hears a tactical approach. And without a tactical approach? He's expecting you to come to him, Hale said. That was always the design. The note, Wills, the photograph at your apartment. All of it was meant to drive you here alone and afraid and looking for a negotiation. I'm not afraid, she said. I know, he said. And then quietly, that's what he doesn't understand about you. He read your file and he thinks he knows you, but your file was written about a different person. She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she could have said, things she'd thought over 4 years, in the way you rehearsed conversations with people you never expected to have them with. She didn't say any of them. They weren't relevant right now. How do we get 7 people out of that building without Price going through the tunnel? She said. Hale reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded paper, hand-drawn, she could see immediately, detailed and careful, and held it out to her. The basement communications array runs on a single junction box on the east wall, he said. If it goes offline, Price loses contact with every Lattice asset he's been managing. That makes him unpredictable, which makes him dangerous. But it also means the 6 people around him suddenly don't have a reason to hold position. He paused. 5 of those 6 are field operatives who were coerced into this. People who had nowhere else to go when the Lattice restructured. They're not loyal to Price. They're scared of him. And the 6th? Is someone I'm not going to be able to help you with, he said. His name is Tarrant. He's been with Price since 2017, and he believes in what Price is doing, and he is the only person in that building more dangerous than Price himself. She took the hand-drawn schematic. She looked at it. The basement level, the junction box on the east wall, the tunnel exit in the equipment barn. Every measurement was precise, in the way that all of Hale's work was precise, with the obsessive accuracy of a man who built things to last, and then sometimes watched them become weapons. She folded it. One more thing, Hale said. She looked at him. Price knows you're here, he said. He's known since you came out of that culvert. He has a sensor in the drainage channel, added it in 2021, after your design. He held her gaze. He let you take Wills. He wanted you to feel like you'd won that part because he needs you to feel confident enough to come inside. The night air was very still. He's waiting for me, she said. Yes, Hale said. She looked at the compound through the trees, the lit windows, the dark bulk of the main building, the equipment barn hulking to the south. She thought about Dorian Price inside that building, building the scenario he'd built, pulling every string he'd pulled since he first intercepted Hale's contact 6 days ago, convinced that he understood her well enough to predict her. She thought about what Wills had said from the hospital gurney, half under from anesthesia. You didn't look scared at all. She'd told him she was scared, a little. She thought, Price is betting I'll be scared enough to come in on his terms. She thought, he's never been more wrong about anything. Does the junction box have a manual override or does it need to be physically cut? She said. Hale blinked. Slightly. Just slightly. Physical, he said. 3/8 cable. You'd need cutters. Erickson will have cutters, she said, and she turned and walked back toward the staging point, and she heard Victor Hale exhale behind her. Not relief exactly, but the specific sound of someone who had expected a harder conversation and had not gotten it, and wasn't entirely sure whether that was better or worse. She pulled the comms unit out of her jacket and clicked it twice. Rask's voice. Go. I need Erickson, she said. Tell him to bring cutters. 3/8 cable. She paused. And tell Kolb we're going back in. Static for a half second. Then Rask said quietly, How many? Just me, she said. But I need your team at the equipment barn, south side. There's a tunnel exit. If someone comes out of it, you stop them. And if it's Price? She kept walking through the dark and the cold and the wet grass, and the compound lights were visible through the tree line, and somewhere inside that building, a man who had read her file and decided he understood what she was made of was waiting for her to do exactly what he'd designed her to do. Then stop him, she said. She came back into the staging area, and Erickson was already moving toward her with a kit bag open, and Kolb was watching her with the expression of someone trying to decide whether what was happening was controlled or completely out of control, and Rask was on his comms coordinating team movement on the south approach. Nora took the cutters from Erickson. She checked them. She put them in her jacket. She looked at the schematic one more time, memorizing the basement layout, the junction box position, the distance from the main building's interior stairwell to the east wall. 42 steps if she moved fast. 38 if she moved right. She put the schematic in her pocket. She looked at Kolb. When I cut the array, she said, you have approximately 90 seconds before Price understands what happened. Move your people into position the moment you lose the signal from inside. You'll see it on Erickson's monitor. Don't move before. If you move before, he hears it, and this ends badly. Kolb nodded. Once, tight. And if you don't cut the array, Rask said from her left. Then I'll figure something else out, she said. She didn't say it like a woman who was confident. She said it like a woman who was going to do what needed to be done regardless of what confidence felt like. She walked toward the tree line. Behind her, she heard Rask say quietly, to no one in particular, she's going to walk in the front door. She was. The main building's porch was 40 meters ahead through the trees, and the creak in the left door hinge was waiting for her, and Dorian Price was inside that building, so certain of his read on her that she could almost feel his certainty from here, radiating out through the lit windows like heat. She reached the porch steps. She put her hand on the door. And from inside, Dorian Price's voice, calm and almost amused, came clearly through the wood. I wondered how long you'd take. She opened the door, and the light hit her, and she walked in. The room was smaller than she remembered. That was the first thing she noticed, which was the kind of detail that ambushed you in high-stakes moments. Not the man sitting at the table 20 feet away. Not the two armed figures positioned at the room's far corners. Not the fact that the interior had been stripped of everything she'd known and refurnished with the functional minimalism of a long-term operations center. The room was smaller. Or she was different, probably both. Dorian Price stood up when she walked in. He was 51 years old and looked it, in the way that certain men look their age without looking diminished by it. Silver at the temples, lines in the face that were the product of weather and stress and years of decisions made in rooms like this one. He was lean, not tall, with the precise economy of movement that came from decades of training that had long since stopped being conscious. He wore a dark sweater, dark pants, the civilian clothes of someone who had been planning to be here a while. He looked for a moment, almost pleased to see her. That was the part that made her chest tighten. Not his confidence, his pleasure. Nora, he said, you cut your hair. 4 years ago, she said. It suits you. He gestured to the chair across the table from him. A simple wooden chair positioned to face the door, positioned so that anyone sitting in it had their back to the two armed figures in the corners and no line to any exit. She didn't sit. He noted that without expression and sat back down himself. I wasn't sure you'd come alone. I'm not sure I did, she said, a small, genuine smile. You did. My sensors on the south approach are still quiet. He folded his hands on the table. Wills is gone, obviously. That's fine. He was a means, not an end. You know that. I know a lot of things, she said. She was looking at the room while she talked to him. Not obviously, not the sweeping assessment of someone searching for something, but the ambient, steady intake of a person who had been trained to read spaces the way other people read text. The two men in the corners, left one had his weight slightly back, right foot dominant, the stance of someone who was present but not acutely ready. The right one was tighter, weight forward, eyes tracking her with the specific attention of someone who'd been briefed on what she could do. Tarrant, probably, on the right. Hale had said Tarrant was the dangerous one, and she could feel that from here, the particular quality of attention that came from someone who was not performing alertness, but actually felt it. The junction box was in the basement. The stairwell door was on the east wall, behind her and to her left, 10 feet. She'd counted the steps from the schematic. 38 if she moved right. Sit down, Price said. Not commanding, suggesting, with the patience of someone who had time. I'm okay, she said. I know you're mapping the room, he said. I'd be disappointed if you weren't. Sit anyway. She sat, because refusing would tell him she was preparing to move, and she needed him to believe she was negotiating. The hospital, she said. Marcus Delvain. A resource with a crisis of conscience, Price said. He'd been carrying materials for us for 2 years. When he started asking questions he couldn't unask, I needed a contained solution. Using him at Harwick accomplished 2 things at once. Neutralized the resource, drew you out, confirmed your current capability. He said it with the flat informational quality of someone describing a logistics problem. The photographs were already there. He was going to be carrying them regardless. It was efficient. He could have died, she said. Yes, Price said. He didn't. Because I was there. Because you were there, he agreed, which was the other function of the design. He looked at her. I needed to see what 4 years had done to you, whether Harwick had softened something essential. The answer was no, clearly, which is why we're having this conversation instead of a different one. She felt the particular coldness of being assessed, of having her whole morning cataloged as data in someone else's planning process. She'd known, coming in, that this was how Price operated. Understanding it intellectually didn't make sitting across from it any more comfortable. What conversation did you want to have? She said. He leaned back slightly. The lattice is restructuring. The Eastern Corridor has been under my operational control for 4 months, but the larger network is in transition. Old frameworks, old loyalties, not viable in the current environment. I'm building something that works differently. He paused. I want you to be part of it. She looked at him for a moment. You took a Navy operator hostage and drove me to a decommissioned training compound at 3 in the morning to offer me a job. I drove you here to have a conversation, he said. Will's was a pressure mechanism, not a demonstration of intent. You know the difference. I know every mechanism you've ever used, she said. I trained under the people who designed most of them. Under Victor Hale, Price said. His voice didn't change, but something around his eyes did. A tightening, brief, and controlled. Who is currently standing in my tree line. Nora kept her face still. I know Hale made contact with you, Price said. I know he gave you the compound layout. I know he told you about the basement. He was watching her the way Rask watched rooms, gathering information that the neutral expression above was refusing to signal. Victor Hale has been managing his guilt for 9 years. He thinks coming in from the cold makes him something other than the architect of everything he claims to regret. A pause. He's wrong, but his intelligence is accurate, if that's what you're wondering. She said nothing. The junction box is on the east wall, Price said. 42 steps from the stairwell. 38 if you move efficiently. He held her gaze. I know exactly what he told you and exactly what you're planning, Nora. Because I would have planned the same thing. I trained on the same material you did. The room was very quiet. The weight of the cutters in her jacket pocket was suddenly both present and irrelevant. Then why let me in, she said. Because the plan isn't the point, he said. The plan is a test. You came in alone, which tells me you're still operating on instinct rather than the institutional caution that ruins field judgment. You sat down when I asked, which tells me you're managing rather than reacting. And you haven't moved toward the stairwell yet, which tells me you're still listening. He tilted his head slightly. You're the best operational mind that came through the Trevik program. I've read every file. You're better than anyone who went through after you, including people who stayed. Including you? She said. I never went through Trevik, he said. I came up a different way, which is, I think, the difference between us that matters. He leaned forward slightly. I see the world as it is. You see it as you think it should be, and then you try to force the gap closed. It's a beautiful instinct and a practical limitation. Kessler, she said. The word sat on the table between them like something physical. Kessler, he repeated. 6 in, 2 out. You designed the parameters knowing the site was compromised. You sent them in anyway because pulling the operation would have required disclosing the intelligence failure to people above your pay grade, and you decided 4 lives were cheaper than that disclosure. She kept her voice even. I found the documentation. That's why I closed the file and walked away. Not because of principle in the abstract, because I found the actual documentation and I know exactly what you did and why you did it. Price was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said. The single word was more unsettling than any denial would have been, because it was true, and he knew it was true, and he was not, she understood, ashamed of it. He had made a calculation, and 4 people had died, and he had filed the report and moved forward, because that was the architecture of how he thought, not without awareness of consequence, but with the complete conviction that his assessment of necessity was correct. You could have ruled beside me, he said, quieter now. That's not flattery. It's a statement of operational fact. The network I'm building needs someone who understands field reality and institutional structure with equal fluency. You are that person. You have been for years. I'd rather save strangers than become you, she said. Something moved across his face. Not anger, something more considered. That's a very clean line, he said. Do you actually believe it? Yes, she said. Even knowing that the strangers you save this week will be put in danger by the structural failures that my work was trying to address? Even knowing that the institutional rot that produced Kessler is still running, still making those calculations, just with less efficiency and more collateral? He wasn't raising his voice. He never raised his voice. You left, and the problems didn't leave with you. I know, she said. Then, I know, she said again. I know that I left and things continued to be broken. I know that I haven't fixed anything from Harwick. I know that 6 years of Tuesday mornings and trauma charting is not a solution to Kessler. She looked at him directly. But it is a life, and it is mine, and the answer to a broken system is not you. He looked at her for a long time. The 2 armed figures in the corners hadn't moved. The generator hummed from the equipment barn. Somewhere outside, in the dark and the cold, Kolb's team was positioned at the south approach, and Rask's team was at the tunnel exit, and Victor Hale was standing at the tree line, and Erickson was watching a signal monitor, and everyone was waiting. Then we're at an impasse, Price said. We're not, she said, because you made a mistake. He waited. You told me you knew my plan, she said. The junction box, the stairwell, 38 steps. You told me because you wanted me to understand that my plan was visible to you, which was supposed to make me feel that I had no options except the ones you were offering. She paused. But you spent so much time telling me you knew my plan that you stopped watching whether I was still running it. Price's expression shifted, just slightly, the micro-expression of someone whose certainty has just developed a crack. Her right hand came out of her jacket pocket with the cutters. She didn't go for the stairwell. She went under the table, fast, lower than he expected, because he was tracking for a move toward the stairwell, and she was already moving sideways toward the east wall and the floor-level electrical conduit that ran along the baseboard, the one Hale's schematic had shown, but that she'd identified independently from memory, the one that fed both the main room's communications equipment and the junction box below through a shared trunk line. Tarrant was moving from the right corner. Fast. He was as fast as Hale had said, crossing the room in the time it took most people to register that they needed to move. She was already at the baseboard. The conduit was where it should be, gray PVC housing, the cable bundle inside it rated for the amperage of a communications array, not designed to be accessed from this point, but not designed to be inaccessible either. She cut it. Not clean. The cutters were rated for 3/8 cable, and this was close to 1/2 inch, and it took 2 bites, and she could feel Terrence's hand reaching for her shoulder when the second bite went through and the lights went out. Full dark. Not the gradual dark of a dimmer switch. Instant, complete. The darkness of a building that had just lost all electrical power simultaneously, main and backup, both because the trunk line fed the backup relay too, which she had known and Price had apparently not considered, or had considered and dismissed as a factor because he was so certain she was going for the basement. She was already moving. She had Terrence's wrist, had grabbed it when she felt his hand reach her shoulder, had the joint in a position that was going to be very painful if he tried to pull away. And she used his own forward momentum to put him down, controlled, face to the floor. And she put her knee on his back and she said to the room, in the darkness and the sudden silence where the generator hum had been, "Nobody move. I mean that. I know where every one of you is standing." She didn't know exactly. She had good estimates. But the dark was equal, and her estimates were better than theirs. A light came on, a flashlight from Price's direction, which told her he'd had it ready, which told her he was adapting rather than panicking, which she'd expected. The beam found her, on the floor with Terrence pinned, and she looked directly into it. "Nora," Price said. His voice was still controlled. "This doesn't change." The south wall exploded inward. Not literally. No explosive, no breach charge. But Kolb's team hit the equipment barn entrance and the tunnel exit simultaneously in the 90 seconds she'd bought them, and the sound of that entry was percussive enough to fill the compound like a physical pressure wave. And 2 seconds later, the main building's back door came in, and the tactical team that had been waiting in the cold mountain air for 38 minutes moved through the building with the specific efficient violence of people who had been very patient and were now done being patient. The left corner operative went down without a fight. He had his hands up before the tactical team reached him, which confirmed what Hale had said about the coerced operatives. He didn't have enough loyalty to Price to make the math work when the math had clearly changed. Terrence tried. Even pinned, even in the dark, even with Nora's knee on his upper back, he tried. Rolled hard left. Got a hand free. Came up fast in the returning flashlight beam with the trained aggression of someone who believed he could still change the outcome. He was probably right, under any normal circumstances. He was not dealing with normal circumstances. Rask came through the back door at a run, and Terrence redirected toward him, and they went into each other with the controlled brutality of two people who were both very good at this. And it was not clean and it was not brief, and when it was over, Terrence was zip-tied and Rask was bleeding from his left eyebrow and breathing hard but upright, which Nora decided was the outcome she was going to accept. She turned to find Price. He was gone. The flashlight was on the floor, still lit, illuminating an empty chair and an overturned table in the east wall where she'd cut the conduit. The stairwell door was open. She could see it from where she stood, ajar, which meant he'd gone down, which meant the basement, which meant the tunnel. She ran. Down the stairwell, 8 steps, concrete walls, the smell of electrical burn from the cut line. The basement was darker than the main floor, no ambient light at all, and she pulled out her own light, a small one, clipped to her jacket, that she'd taken from Erickson's kit, and swept it across the room as she moved. The junction box on the east wall was exactly where the schematic showed it, cut cables hanging from the housing, the communications array dark and silent in a way that would have looked peaceful if she had time to find anything peaceful. She moved past it toward the tunnel entrance, a steel door in the south wall, handle type, currently moving away from her. She hit the door at speed. The tunnel was narrow and low, and Price was 10 meters ahead of her and moving fast. She could hear him, not his footsteps. He was too controlled for that, but his breathing, the specific cadence of someone pushing hard through a confined space. She moved faster. The tunnel was 40 meters from the schematic. She was at 20 by her count. At 30, the end visible now, a square of slightly lighter dark where the equipment barn floor above let in the barest ambient. She came up through the tunnel exit into the equipment barn, and Price was at the barn door and Rask's team was on the other side of it. He stopped. He turned around. He was breathing harder than she'd expected, which told her the tunnel had cost him more than he'd anticipated, which told her that 51-year-old Dorian Price was not exactly the same as the man who had designed this compound. She filed that away not with satisfaction, but with the plain accuracy of an assessment. He looked at her. The barn was dark except for the thin gray of pre-dawn beginning at the east-facing gap in the siding, and in that light he looked older than he'd looked inside, and less like someone with the situation under control. "There are 4 exit points on this property," he said. "Your people have 3 of them. I know, she said. The north approach is open, he said. My vehicle is on the north road. He paused. If you let me walk out through this barn door, I'm not going to do that, she said. I will give you everything, he said. Every document, every operation, every name currently active in the Eastern Corridor. Complete network disclosure. I have it all archived off-site, dead man's switch, automatically transmitted to 6 independent addresses if I don't check in by noon. He looked at her steadily. You want Kessler resolved. You want the people who made those decisions to face accountability. I am the only one who can give you the evidence to make that happen, and I will give it to you. And all I'm asking, you're asking me to let you walk, she said. Yes. She looked at him. She thought about the 6 independent addresses and whether they were real and whether the dead man's switch was real, and the honest answer was that she didn't know. He might have that documentation. He probably had something. Price always had something. That was the architecture of how he operated, layers of insurance and leverage stacked in sequence. Whether it was what he was claiming right now, in a barn at 4 in the morning, with her between him and the only open exit, she couldn't know. She thought about 4 people who hadn't come home from Kessler. She thought about Derek Will's daughter, who had almost been added to that list. She thought about Marcus Delvane, who had been used and then used again and was currently in federal custody, not because he was a bad person, but because he had made the mistake of having doubts and expressing them to someone who didn't tolerate doubts. You told me we were at an impasse, she said. We weren't. I had a plan. She looked at him. You've spent this entire conversation telling me what I'm made of. Let me tell you something in return. She took one step toward him. I have been a trauma nurse for 6 years. I have sat with people in the worst hours of their lives. I have held pressure on wounds I knew weren't going to close in time and done it anyway. I have watched people make the choice to fight even when everything about their situation said not to. Another step. The difference between you and me isn't that I see the world as it should be and you see it as it is. The difference is that I know what it costs to choose to stay human inside a broken system, and you decided that cost was too high, and I decided it wasn't. She stopped. That cost doesn't make me naive. It makes me the person you've spent the last 2 years trying to recruit because you need someone who can do what I do, and you can't do it yourself anymore. Price was quiet. The barn door behind him shifted. Rask's team on the other side, holding position, waiting. Give yourself up, she said, not because you have no options, because you know what happens to the people who run, and you know what happens to the people who come in with documentation, and you're a man who has spent his whole life making calculations. Make this one correctly. A long silence. The pre-dawn gray at the barn's east siding was getting lighter by degrees, the way it did in mountains in October. Slow and cold and indifferent to everything happening underneath it. Dorian Price looked at her for a long moment. His face was doing something complicated that she didn't have a single name for. Then he reached into his jacket and removed a phone, a satellite-capable handset, the kind that stored encrypted files locally. And he set it on the equipment shelf beside him with a careful, deliberate motion, and he put his hands at his sides. There's a passcode, he said. I assumed, she said. 774192, he said. All documentation is in a folder labeled Maintenance Logs. Something around his mouth shifted, not quite a smile and not quite bitterness. Something in between that didn't have a clean category. There are 17 names in that folder. Some of them you'll recognize. Some of them will surprise you. He turned around. He put his hands on the back of his head and waited. She opened the barn door and Rask's team came in, and the zip ties went on, and Price went to his knees in the equipment barn without being forced, which was either dignity or calculation, and was probably some of both. And Nora stood and watched it happen, and felt something she hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, not relief exactly, not the clean, uncomplicated feeling that movies assign to these moments, but something more like a long exhale after holding something heavy for a very long distance. She picked up the satellite phone. Dawn came over the Trevik compound slowly and without drama. By 6 o'clock, all 7 occupants of the main building were in federal custody. The 5th through 7th operatives, the ones Hale had called coerced, were separated from Price and Tarrant and processed under a different protocol, which Kolb handled with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and knew that the cooperation of reluctant operatives was worth more than another conviction. Erickson had the communications array partially restored on emergency power by 6:15 and was already working through the data on what the Eastern Corridor had been running for the past 4 months. And the picture that was emerging from his work was, by his expression, significant in a way that would take weeks to fully process. Victor Hale was in federal custody too, which he'd apparently expected, and which he submitted to without argument. Nora watched them walk him to the transport vehicle across the compound's muddy access road, and she felt the familiar, complicated weight of his presence, the way it always had both more and less gravity than it should. He looked at her once, across the distance. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. He got into the vehicle. Rask found her at the compound's outer fence, standing with her hands in her jacket pockets, looking at the mountains. The sun was coming up behind them in that way it did in the valley, hitting the far peaks before the ground, so that the light came from above before it came from the horizon. His eyebrow had stopped bleeding. Someone had taped it, badly, the tape crooked, the field dressing work of someone who'd done it themselves in poor light. And he had the look of a man who'd been awake for 24 hours and wasn't going to admit it bothered him. "Wills is at Harwick General," he said, "back in room 412. His daughter's flying in this morning." "Good," she said. "His exact words when we told him you'd gone back in were not printable," Rask said. "The general sentiment was complimentary." She almost smiled. "Kolb wants your statement," he said. "She also wants to offer you something, I think. She didn't say what, but I've been doing this long enough that I know the face she makes when she's about to offer someone something significant." He paused. "I'll give you fair warning. It's the face she made right before she offered me a posting I turned down 4 times before I finally took it." Nora looked at the mountains. "I have rounds at 6:30. Rask stared at her. I told her last night, 6:30 rounds." She pulled her hands out of her pockets. "I'm going to give Kolb my statement. I'm going to walk her through the phone and what Price told me about the passcode and the folder. Then I'm going to get cleaned up and drive back to Harwick and do my shift." She looked at him. "Wills is going to need monitoring today. Post-surgical extraction patient who spent the night in a cold secondary building with a compromised dressing. His inflammatory markers are going to be elevated, and someone should actually review his wound site this morning, rather than just running the standard post-op check." Rask opened his mouth and closed it again. "He's going to be fine," she said. "He's young and his baseline health is good, and the dressing held, and I'll be able to tell what I'm looking at as soon as I see him." She looked at Rask. "But he's 26 and he has a daughter, and I would like to be the one who checks on him this morning." A long pause. "You're going to walk into that hospital," Rask said, "after all of—" He gestured toward the compound, toward the mountain, toward the general direction of everything that had happened since 9:14 yesterday morning. "In your scrubs." "Same ones I wore yesterday," she said. "They're in the bag." He looked at her. He shook his head, and it wasn't dismissal, wasn't frustration. It was the specific headshake of someone encountering something they don't have a category for and are going to have to find one. "I'll drive you to Kolb," he said. They walked back across the compound together in the early light, Nora in her wet jacket and river boots with the satellite phone in her pocket, and the small folded schematic, and the comms unit, and the cutters, and Rask beside her with his badly taped eyebrow, and his 24 hours of no sleep, and the compound around them was full of the activity of a federal operation in its aftermath phase. Evidence teams, transport vehicles, Erickson's people pulling equipment from the basement. She was 3 meters from Kolb's position when Erickson came out of the main building at a pace that was faster than his baseline and called across the compound, "Kolb, I need you inside, now." Kolb turned. "What is it?" Erickson looked at his tablet. He looked at Kolb. Then he looked at Nora, with the expression of a man who had just found something that changed the shape of everything that had come before it. "The 17 names in Price's documentation," he said. "I've been cross-referencing." He paused. "Name number 14 is Adrian Kolb." The compound went quiet. Not all of it. The activity continued. The evidence teams kept moving. The birds in the tree line continued their early noise. But the specific pocket of quiet that formed around Kolb and Erickson and Nora and Rask in those 3 seconds was complete. Kolb's face did nothing, absolutely nothing, which was, Nora thought, its own answer. Nora looked at the satellite phone in her hand. She looked at Kolb. She thought about the agents who had arrived at Harwick PD and taken the photographs and left without speaking to her. She thought about how quickly Kolb had arrived after Rask made his call. She thought about how Kolb had known about the adhesive residue on the door frame before anyone had told her about the note. She thought about how Price had said, "I know exactly what he told you and exactly what you're planning." Not because he'd analyzed the situation from first principles, because he'd had someone inside the response team who had been feeding him information in real time, who had known about Hale's contact, had known what Hale gave them, had known what Nora was planning, and had relayed every piece of it back to the compound. The documentation in Price's phone wasn't evidence of Kolb's involvement in Kessler. It was evidence of something worse. She was the one who'd made sure Price knew that Nora was coming. Nora didn't move. That was the first thing. The stillness. Not the frozen stillness of shock, but the deliberate stillness of someone making an immediate inventory of a situation that had just changed its fundamental shape. Rask was to her left. Erickson was at the main building doorway. Kolb's 2 tactical team members were 12 feet behind Kolb, near the transport vehicles, not yet reading the room. Kolb had a sidearm. So did Rask. So did every tactical member in the compound. The math of the next 10 seconds depended entirely on what Kolb decided to do. And Kolb was a woman who made decisions fast, which meant Nora had less time than she would have liked. She looked at Kolb. Kolb looked back at her. The nothing on her face was still there, but it was working harder now, and underneath it something was shifting. Not guilt, not fear exactly, but the expression of a person running the same calculation Nora was running and arriving at the same answer. "Rask," Kolb said, and her hand moved toward her sidearm. "Don't," Nora said. The word came out flat and absolute, and Kolb's hand stopped. Not because the word was threatening, because of how it was said, with the same quality that had stopped Marcus Delvane's rifle in the lobby of Harwick General 2 days ago, the quality that had nothing to do with volume and everything to do with the complete absence of doubt. "Erickson," Nora said, without looking away from Kolb. "Call it in. Use the NSA line, not DIA. Right now." She heard Erickson move behind her, heard the click of his satellite handset. Kolb's jaw tightened. "You don't understand what you're looking at." "I think I do," Nora said. "Name 14 in a list compiled by a man who has every reason to manufacture." "He didn't manufacture anything," Nora said. "Price gave me the passcode voluntarily, in the barn, before I opened the door. He had no way to know who would be reading those files. He gave them to me because he calculated that full disclosure was his best outcome, and he was right, and he had no reason to fabricate your name, because fabricating it gains him nothing. It actually gains him an enemy, if you were still positioned to run interference for him." She paused. "How long?" Kolb was quiet. "How long?" Nora said again, not raising her voice. 7 years, Kolb said. And then, in a way that sounded neither proud nor ashamed but simply exhausted, the way a person sounded when they'd been carrying something too long and had finally put it down. "Kessler was mine. The intelligence failure was mine. Price covered it. I covered Price. Every year that went by made it harder to find an exit." She looked at Nora steadily. "When Hale made contact, I thought—" She stopped. "It doesn't matter what I thought." "No," Nora agreed. "It doesn't." Rask stepped forward. His face was doing nothing readable, which was its own kind of controlled reaction. He took Kolb's sidearm from her holster with a motion that was professional and careful and gave nothing away emotionally, and Kolb let him, and neither of them spoke while it happened. Across the compound, Erickson was on the phone, and his voice was low and steady and clipping through a situation report that was going to set off a very specific chain of events in several agencies before sunrise. The mountains stood in the early light exactly as they'd been standing. The next 4 hours were the kind of organized chaos that Nora was, by now, familiar enough with to move through efficiently. NSA and DIA Internal Affairs arrived at the compound by 8 o'clock, which was fast enough to tell her that Erickson's call had landed in exactly the right place, and that she hadn't been wrong to trust his instinct about which line to use. Adrienne Kolb was taken into federal custody without incident. She didn't resist, didn't argue, walked to the vehicle with the same controlled bearing she'd walked into rooms with her entire career, and the only thing she said when the door was closing was directed at no one in particular. The Kessler families deserved the documentation. Nobody answered her. The door closed. Dorian Price was already in a separate transport, heading to a federal facility that Erickson refused to name out loud, which was fine. Tarrant was being processed on site with the particular extra attention that someone with his profile required. The 5 coerced operatives were in a holding pattern pending interviews that would take days to complete. Victor Hale's transport had already left the compound. Nora thought about that on the drive back to Harwick, riding in the passenger seat of a DIA vehicle driven by someone who'd introduced himself as Agent Morrow and hadn't said anything since. She thought about Hale standing at the tree line with his hand raised. She thought about the 7 months she'd spent at Trevick, 25 years old, and convinced she was learning things that would make her useful, and the way Hale had taught her to read spaces and people and the geometry of dangerous situations. She thought about how you carried the things people gave you, even when you had stopped being who you were when they gave them. I wasn't a good man. He wasn't a simple man either. He had done things that deserved consequences, and he was going to face them, and that was the correct outcome. And it didn't erase what the training had cost him to give, or what it had cost her to receive, or the fact that last night she had stood in a dark forest and trusted the schematic he handed her, and it had been accurate. The world was very rarely clean. She'd known that when she chose Harwick. She knew it now, sitting in the passenger seat watching the Virginia mountains come down from the skyline as the road curved back toward the valley. She made it to Harwick General by 9:40. She was 40 minutes late for rounds, which Paula, the charge nurse, acknowledged, with the expression of someone who had seen the news and was choosing not to ask questions. And Nora changed into fresh scrubs from her locker and washed her face and her hands at the sink in the staff bathroom and looked at herself in the mirror for a moment. The scar along her jaw, the circles under her eyes, the face of a woman who had not slept in approximately 27 hours and who was about to go do her job. And then she went to work. Room 412 first. Derek Wills was awake. He'd been awake for a while, she could tell. The particular alert, tired look of someone who'd been lying in a hospital bed running through a mental replay for hours. His daughter was there, a girl of about 4, asleep in the vinyl visitor chair with her cheek on her arm, her small body doing the complete and unself-conscious collapse into sleep that only very young children managed. Wills watched Nora come in and watched her check his wound site and review his chart, and he didn't say anything until she was done. "How bad is it?" he said quietly, so as not to wake his daughter. "Inflammation is elevated but not alarming. The dressing held through everything last night, which is honestly better than it had any right to." She made a note in his chart. "You're going to be here another 3 days minimum. The leg needs to be properly immobilized and monitored before you're cleared for any travel." "I know." "Do you actually know, or are you planning to try to leave tomorrow?" He had the grace to look caught. "I know," he said again, more carefully. She almost smiled. She looked at his daughter sleeping in the chair. "How old?" 4.5, he said. "She tells people 4.5 specifically, very insistent about the half." "She should be," Nora said. She started to leave and Wills said, "Nora." She turned. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first time, from the gurney, with that particular focused attention of someone trying to see past the surface of what they were looking at. "Rask called me," he said. "He told me what happened. Not all of it, but enough." She waited. "He said you went back in after you got me out," Wills said. "He said you walked in the front door." "I did," she said. "Why?" She thought about it. The honest answer was layered in a way that was too long for a hospital room at 10 in the morning, so she gave him the part of it that was true and simple. Because someone needed to. Wills looked at her for another moment. His daughter made a small sound in her sleep and resettled her arm without waking. He looked at his daughter and then back at Nora. "Thank you," he said. She nodded once and left. The formal interviews began that afternoon. There were 3 of them, over 2 days, in 3 different rooms with 3 different sets of investigators representing NSA, DIA Internal Affairs, and the Department of Justice, and Nora gave each of them the same account, chronological, factual, without editorializing. She gave them the timeline of her lattice involvement from recruitment to departure. She gave them the Kessler documentation as she knew it. She gave them everything she'd seen in Price's compound and everything Hale had told her at the tree line and everything Kolb had said in those final minutes in the compound yard. She did not make it easier than it was. She did not make it harder either. She gave them what she had observed and what she had done and what she had decided and why. The investigator from DOJ, a woman in her 40s named Bressler, who had the kind of focused patience that made her good at her job, asked on the second day, "When you decided to go back inside the compound, did you consider waiting for tactical backup to be repositioned?" "Yes," Nora said, "and you decided against it." "I decided that the time cost of repositioning would allow Price to move to the tunnel, and that a mobile Price with the documentation in his possession was a worse outcome than an unpredictable engagement with a contained Price." She paused. "I also knew the compound better than anyone else present except Victor Hale, and I didn't want to send someone else in on my knowledge." Bressler made a note. "That's an unusual risk calculation for a civilian to make." "I'm a nurse," Nora said. "We make risk calculations in deteriorating situations constantly. The tools are different, not the process." Bressler looked at her. Something shifted in her face. Not the professional neutrality of the interview, something more human than that. A look Nora had seen before on people who were revising their picture of something mid-conversation. "Can I ask you something off the record?" "You can ask," Nora said. "Why Harwick? 6 years in a Virginia trauma unit when you could have—" She stopped herself. "That's probably not useful." "It's a fair question," Nora said. "Harwick is where I could be useful in a way that didn't cost me who I was. The work is real. The people are real. Nobody in room 7 cares what I used to be. They just need someone to be there with them right now." She looked at her hands on the table. "I needed to do work that was real in that specific way." After a while, Harwick stopped being a hiding place and became an actual life. She looked up. "I don't regret 6 years of Tuesday mornings." Bressler wrote something. She didn't say what. The institutional consequences moved faster than these things usually moved, which Erickson told her later was a function of how thoroughly Price's documentation had done its work. 17 names, hundreds of pages of operational records, the full architecture of the Eastern Corridor going back 9 years. The kind of evidence package that didn't leave room for managed disclosure or strategic delay. Dorian Price was formally charged on 8 counts, including conspiracy, obstruction, and 4 counts connected specifically to the Kessler incident and its aftermath. The proceedings would take time. These things always took time. But the DOJ was moving with the particular focused energy of an institution that had been handed a case with no exits. Adrienne Kolb was charged separately, and the specific charges were not made public, and she did not contest them. What was made public, because Kolb insisted on it, was a formal acknowledgement of the Kessler operational failure and the names of the 4 people who had not come home. The families had been told there was a classified equipment failure. The new disclosure said otherwise. It said their people had gone into a compromised site on the authorization of officers who knew the intelligence was degraded and had made the calculation that the operation was worth proceeding. It was not an adequate accounting. Nothing was going to be an adequate accounting. But it was a true one, and Nora, reading the public statement in the break room at Harwick General on a Thursday afternoon, thought about what she'd said to Price in the compound. The answer to a broken system is not you, and understood that the corollary was equally true. The answer to a broken system was also not any single person, not her, not Hale, in his belated remorse, not Kolb's eventual honesty. It was the slow, grinding, imperfect work of institutions being held to their own stated standards, which was unsatisfying and necessary and the best available option. The Kessler families issued a joint statement. She didn't read it. She didn't need to. She already knew what it said, in the way you knew things that were true before they were written down. 3 weeks after the Trevick compound, Rask walked into Harwick General on a Tuesday morning and found her at the nurse's station doing paperwork. I was in civilian clothes again, which told her this wasn't an official visit, and he was carrying 2 coffees, which told her he'd asked someone what she drank, which meant he'd talked to Paula, which meant Paula was now deeply curious about who he was, which Nora was going to have to address at some point. He set 1 coffee on the desk in front of her. "I have rounds in 20 minutes, she said. "I know," he said. "I'll be quick." He leaned against the counter. He looked like he'd slept, finally, which was an improvement. The eyebrow tape was gone, a clean scar in its place, small and new. "NSA's formal review of your lattice involvement is closed. No adverse findings. Everything you told Bressler is on record as cooperative disclosure, and the DOJ has formally confirmed you have no outstanding liability for your prior operational involvement." She picked up the coffee. Okay. That's it? Okay? I didn't expect different, she said. I didn't do anything that warranted liability. He looked at her for a moment. Kolb's plea finalized yesterday. She's cooperating fully on the remaining active lattice cases in exchange for a reduced sentence. Price goes to trial in March. He paused. Tarrant is in federal custody and has not cooperated with anything. He'll be in federal custody for a long time. Wills? She said. Back on his feet. Cleared for limited duty last week. Something in Rask's expression shifted toward what she might have called warmth if she were characterizing it. He told me to tell you the food at Harwick General is still terrible. He's not wrong, she said. Rask was quiet for a moment. He looked around the nurse's station, at the dry erase board and the medication cart, and the corridor beyond with its particular mid-morning hospital rhythm. There's an offer, he said. I'm not the person who makes it, that's above my level. But I was asked to convey it because apparently I'm the person you're most likely to listen to. He said it without vanity, just as an operational assessment. NSA wants to create an advisory position, formally structured, part-time commitment, focused specifically on lattice network remnants and the broader coerced operative recovery program. The people who were inside the lattice and didn't have another exit the way you did. He looked at her. They need someone who understands that pipeline from the inside. Someone who knows what it costs to walk away and how to help people find that cost worth paying. Nora set down the coffee. She looked at the corridor for a moment, at a patient being walked by a physical therapist, slow, careful steps, the PT's hand ready at the elbow. Part-time, she said. Part-time, he confirmed. Harwick stays, round stay, the Tuesday morning stay. She thought about it. Not the way she thought about tactical problems. Not with the rapid geometric assessment she'd spent the last 2 weeks trying to put back in its compartment, but the slower, more ordinary way of thinking about a choice that was going to change things and being honest about whether you wanted it changed. She thought about the 5 operatives from the Trevick compound who had been in processing for 3 weeks. She thought about Marcus Delvane in federal custody, who had tried to find a way out of the lattice and been used as a weapon instead. She thought about the architecture of systems that took people and used them up, and the difference between the people who designed those systems and the people who could help others find the exit. When do they need an answer? She said. They said, take your time, Rask said. I'm told that means 2 weeks. She nodded. She picked up her coffee and her tablet. Tell them I'll have an answer by Thursday, she said. Rask looked like he'd expected her to take the 2 weeks. That's fast. I know what I'm going to decide, she said. I just need to make sure I'm deciding it for the right reasons, and I need about 48 hours to do that. She stood up from the nurse's station. I have a patient in room 6 whose potassium levels have been running low, and nobody has adequately addressed the underlying cause. And I have a post-op in room 11 who needs his dressing changed, and I have a new admission in room 2 who came in scared and alone and needs someone to actually talk to her. She looked at Rask. So, if we're done. We're done, he said. She walked. At the end of the corridor, she heard him call, Nora. She turned. He was still at the nurse's station, coffee in hand, and he looked at her with the evaluating gray eyes that had first looked at her across the lobby of this hospital 3 weeks ago, with the specific expression of a man who thought he was looking at a floor nurse and was rapidly revising that understanding. How do you do it? He said. Come back here after... He didn't finish the sentence because the sentence covered too much. She thought about it. The real answer, not the clean one. The lobby, she said. Marcus Delvane standing there with that rifle, shaking, afraid of everything including himself. And I walked toward him not because I was certain I could stop it, but because someone had to be the person who walked toward it. She looked at Rask. That's what this place is. Every day, someone is in the worst moment of their life, and they need a person to walk toward them instead of away. She paused. I did a lot of things over a lot of years. Some of them I'm proud of, and some of them I'm still working out how to carry. But this, she gestured at the corridor, the rooms, the ordinary clamoring life of the hospital floor around her. This one I'm sure about. Rask nodded, just once, the way he nodded when something landed correctly and didn't require elaboration. She turned and went to room 6. On Thursday, she gave them her answer. Yes, with conditions. She specified the time commitment ceiling, specified that Harwick General remained primary, specified that her role was advisory on human factors and exit pathways, and that she would not be used as an operational asset. They accepted all three conditions without argument, which told her they'd expected them and had already decided they were worth it. She didn't tell anyone at the hospital, not because it was secret, but because it wasn't relevant to what happened inside those walls. Paula didn't need to know. The patients didn't need to know. Dr. Thacker, who had finally and correctly learned her last name and deployed it twice in the past week, with the slightly overcorrected effort of someone making up for a long deficit, did not need to know. What they needed was the same thing they'd always needed from her: to be seen, to be treated with competence and honesty, to have someone in the room who was paying attention. She had always been good at that. She had always been the person in the room paying attention when everyone else was looking somewhere else. She had been underestimated for it, dismissed for it, overlooked for it, for most of the 6 years she'd worn these scrubs in these corridors. And she had let herself be overlooked, not from insecurity, but from the deliberate, considered choice of a woman who understood the difference between being visible and being present. She did not need the credit. She had never needed the credit. What she had needed, what she had spent 6 years building toward without fully knowing it, was the certainty that the choices she'd made were the right ones. Not perfect, not clean, not the kind that came without cost or compromise or the weight of things she couldn't undo, but right, in the fundamental sense, in the sense that she could account for them and stand behind them and look at the corridor outside room 6 at 10 on a Tuesday morning and know, without performance or pretense, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The hospital moved around her. A cart rattled past. Someone laughed at the far end of the floor. A monitor beeped twice and steadied. The particular relentless ordinary life of a place where people came when things went wrong, and where, if they were fortunate, they found someone who knew how to walk toward the hard thing instead of away from it. Nora Callahan pushed open the door to room 6. She went to work. There is a version of this story that ends with a ceremony, a formal recognition, a public acknowledgement, a moment where the institution stands up and says, "We saw her wrong, and now we see her correctly." That version is satisfying in its tidiness. It gives the audience somewhere clean to land. The real version is less tidy and more true. It ends with a nurse in faded blue scrubs checking potassium levels in a room that smells like antiseptic and breakfast trays, doing a job that most people walk past without noticing. It ends without applause. It ends with the work. The ones who are truly strong are not the ones who need you to see their strength. They are the ones who kept showing up quietly in the spaces where the work was real, long before anyone was paying attention, and who will keep showing up long after the cameras are gone. That is the part they never put in the file. That is the